Thanks for joining me on this video. This is essentially just going to be a recap of our resident meetings that we had on May 21st and 22nd at the Wellington Housing Authority Clubhouse. Just wanted to put this video together so that folks that weren't able to attend can still get some of this information and also develop questions if you have any, so that way we can get feedback to you. This is a list of the team members from Housing Catalyst that were present at the meeting. Julie Bruin, our CEO and Executive Director for Housing Catalyst. Myself, Preston Nakayama. I'm a project manager, and this is my primary project right now. Patty Candelario, our Housing Voucher Specialist. Tracy McGraw, our Housing Voucher Manager. And then Misty Gonzalez, who is our Property Manager for Wellington. So the agenda for this slideshow, we'll start out with a background on who Housing Catalyst is, what we do, and why we're going through this process. Then I'll dive a little bit deeper into what Section 18 disposition is, as well as what our estimated timeline is for the process. And finally, as we transition from public housing to housing vouchers, I'll explain a little bit more how that process will look and what residents can expect at that time. During our presentation, we had a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So for the sake of this video, if anybody has questions, I'll have contact information at the end of the slides. So please feel free to reach out, and hopefully we can get all those questions answered for you. Housing Catalyst is one of Northern Colorado's largest affordable housing developers and operators. So our main goal as an organization is to not only continue to provide stable, habitable housing, but also promote more affordable housing in the future. So currently we operate the Fort Collins Housing Authority, the Larimer County Housing Authority, and as it pertains to Wellington, we oversee the Wellington Housing Authority, and later on, as we transition to vouchers, we will be the ones to administer those vouchers. The Wellington Housing Authority owns 42 rental units throughout the town of Wellington, and the big picture of why we're doing this now is that the public housing program has been underfunded for nearly 20 years, and so these properties just have a large growing backlog of capital needs. Things like new roofs are needed, general updates overall, and for us to be able to continue to fund these properties into the future, we need to transition to a different program where we are afforded more funding from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's simply going to make these homes more stable. We obviously want to continue to provide habitable, safe environments for our residents, and with the current funding that we're receiving, we simply have a backlog of capital needs, and we can't upgrade the properties the way we'd like to. So Wellington Housing Authority continues to see funding cuts for public housing, and in basic terms, we are receiving less money than what it takes to operate the homes, and so oftentimes we have to operate out of our reserves. So capital improvements have been limited. We've continued to see deferred maintenance on these properties, and as I mentioned, we simply just want to have a more stable funding stream into the future so that we can continue to provide affordable housing in Wellington, and this process will allow us to do that. So why a Section 18 disposition, and what is a Section 18 disposition? Section 18 is just a section of the 1937 U.S. Housing Act, which grants housing authorities the ability to dispose of their public housing portfolios. And so when I say disposing, it doesn't mean that we're selling the homes or getting rid of them. Wellington Housing Authority will continue to hold these properties and will continue to provide assistance to residents. Disposing here is just kind of a technical term, and the way the language is written in the 1937 Housing Act. So ultimately what we're doing here is just shifting the pot of money. So currently Wellington Housing Authority is funded through the public housing pot of money, and in the future our goal is to make it so that we will be funded under the voucher pot of money. And so residents likely won't even see too much of a shift. The reason we're doing this is the voucher program will provide us with about 3 times the subsidy that public housing does. So as I mentioned, public housing is underfunded currently, and that's why we are unable to maintain the properties the way that we'd like to. And so this is just a great long-term solution for retaining affordable housing in the town of Wellington, and it may even allow us the ability to create more affordable housing. So here I want to discuss a little bit about what housing vouchers are and how they work relative to how the public housing program works. And basically they're very similar. So housing vouchers are essentially just a stipend that will pay a portion of residents' rent. And so it's not too much different from how it works now. It's just, again, a different pot of money that we would be using to fund the homes. And so in most circumstances, your rent will be very similar to the amount you're currently paying. In certain circumstances, if it varies significantly, we'll definitely have conversations with folks individually. But most likely, rents will be very similar to what you're seeing now. And so these housing vouchers will be attached to your home as well. So you can't take the voucher and go move to a different location. They'll be tied to the specific unit. And so that's actually kind of one of the benefits of this program, is that residents won't have to relocate. You can stay in your home. So what does this mean for residents, and what do residents need to do during this process? As I mentioned, housing vouchers will be attached to the home. Misty will still be your property manager, so you won't see any difference there. The actual funding itself will have similar rents, so you may see a slight shift, but it will likely not be significant. And as far as what residents need to do, during the process while we're applying for the Section 18 disposition, residents really won't need to do anything during that process. Ultimately, the stuff that you guys will have to do will only take place after we receive approval for our Section 18 disposition application, as well as our voucher application. And so this could potentially be early 2020 or even spring of 2020. So we definitely have some time there. And as I mentioned, residents won't need to do anything during the process while we're actually working through the application. But when that time does come, all residents will have to do is essentially go through a typical recertification process for the voucher program. So that will be similar to what you've seen when you do your annual recertification for public housing. Also, a typical annual HQS inspection will take place. Nothing too different from what you've seen in the past. And then finally, you'll sign a new lease under the voucher program. So those are the 3 main steps. And the biggest change that you might see is that if you recertify currently at the same time every year, you might just see a shift in the recertification timing, just depending on when we get approval for the application and when we're actually able to issue the vouchers. And so if you had just recertified, for example, a month or 2 ago this year, we're looking at probably a year out before this even happens. So our plans to date, staff has been working on the Section 18 application for about 3 months or so currently. And so there are several steps that we have to meet in order to be able to even submit the application to HUD. So our timing will depend on several factors. We're hoping to submit the Section 18 application in the early fall of this year, potentially late fall. So to hopefully give you a little bit more clear idea of the different steps in the process for us and what it means for residents. This is a very rough timeline, but it's kind of an estimate on when we hope to have things done. So we hope to meet all the steps required by HUD by the fall of 2019. At that point, we will submit our Section 18 application, and that could take anywhere from 60 to potentially 180 days for us to receive a HUD approval. And so it could be, a few months before we even get through that process. Once we receive approval on the Section 18 application, then we have to submit another application for vouchers. And so that process could take another 4 to 6 weeks before we receive a decision from HUD. And then so finally at that point we are allowed to issue the vouchers. So we'll go through the resident recertification process, the HQS inspections, and then finally we'll be able to issue the vouchers. And so residents likely won't need to do anything until at least early 2020, if not March or April of 2020. So our next steps, as I mentioned, we're working through all of the items we need to complete the application for HUD, and ideally we'll submit it in the fall of 2019. After we receive approval for that, hopefully fall of 2019, then we can apply for housing vouchers, and that could take another 4 to 6 weeks. And finally, once we receive approval for vouchers, we can have residents go through the recertification process, do the HQS inspection, and finally we can have residents sign new leases and issue the vouchers. So to summarize what I've said thus far in the presentation, Wellington Housing Authority will be transitioning from public housing to vouchers through a HUD Section 18 disposition, and this is essentially just moving from one pot of money to another pot of money, and so residents likely won't even see a huge difference. And one thing I want to mention here is that this process is being encouraged by HUD. So it's not just Housing Catalyst and Wellington Housing Authority that are going through this process. Housing authorities all over the country are going through this process because it is being encouraged by HUD. Public housing has continued to be underfunded, and so we definitely think this will provide a more stable funding source into the future. And so residents will stay in place based on normal recertification. The only difference you might see is you might see a shift in the recertification timing, and that's just based on when we get approval for the application. It may shift timing a little bit. The voucher program will provide us with nearly 3 times the subsidy that public housing is currently providing us with. And so ultimately this is going to allow us to better maintain the properties and continue to operate them into the future. And it may even allow us the opportunity to push for more affordable housing in the town of Wellington. So lots of perks with this program. One point I want to note here is that although the voucher subsidy is 3 times more than the public housing subsidy, this doesn't really shift what residents will see. Your rents will still be calculated based on your income. It's just that it allows housing authorities to maintain these properties much better because we have capital funds that we can put in to provide things like new roofs and clean up the trees and just overall better maintain the units. So overall, it's a great opportunity for the housing authority, and we really think that this is a much more sustainable option as we move forward. So that wraps up the presentation. I want to encourage everybody to definitely reach out if you have questions or comments or concerns. We definitely would love to address those and get back to you. So if you do have any questions, please just reach out to Misty. Her phone number is here, as well as her email address. So we'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening.